I've been struggling on how to do this video. I do it every couple of years, and what happens is every time I start into this one, it very quickly runs into the weeds and gets really complex. So let me see if I can figure out how to do it in a more simple fashion. And start with this. What I'm going to try to address today is just simply the red or Jonsered versions of what was the Husqvarna 371, 372 chassis. All right, that class of saws. And it all started with the 50mm version, this cylinder right here. 371, it had a single ring piston, big giant transfer ports, and as compared to some of the older designs like this, it had the quad port design versus the 2 ports. See that? You got the 1, 2, 3, 4 to a side. They did things like a little more stroke, you know, help push all that gas and air up through those big giant transfers. And I think this is like one of the pinnacles of chainsaws 2-stroke design. You know, the 50mm introduced in the 90s, Husqvarna 371, which turned into the 372, and then, you know, there were a bunch of different spin-offs from that basic design. And right alongside the 372, very quickly after, they came up with a 365, of which that is one. And here in the States, it was offered with a low top, small filter, as compared to the large filter that the 372 XP had. So 371, 372, 365, and that chassis spawned a whole bunch of red saws, a whole bunch of Jonsereds, because they were basically, you know, using the same basic technology for their product offerings, right? The 372 spun off into the 2071, and the 365 special spawned off into the 2065. And I'm just going to touch on the cylinders first, and then I'm going to go back and just go through the litany of the different models. So this was the granddaddy. A little longer stroke than the 272 that preceded it, a little bit less bore, but it's still the same basic 70cc displacement. And they needed a little bit more primary compression, or a little more ability for the bottom end to pump that additional gas air mix, which it was going to swallow because it was making more horsepower up those giant transfers. Well, the 365 didn't quite need as much for the power band that they wanted, so you can see that not only did the 365 have a smaller displacement, 48mm versus the 50, but it also had fairly substantially smaller transfer ports. Before anyone goes off into the weeds, this right here is proof, the way these run, that bigger isn't always better. Another video for another time, but trust me when I tell you that this 48mm version of these saws will easily handle the same kind of loads and easily make the same kind of power as the stock 50mm version. Another story for a different time. You can go back and look in the videos and see the cookie cut races where it both matched, if not surpassed, the 50mm X-Torqs. So don't get all nervous about small transfers. They also offered what they call an XPW, and it was a little bit larger bore even yet. Instead of having 4850, it was a 51.4mm bore, a little more displacement, closer to 75. And guess what? It also had the smaller transfers, and the power band that this thing was designed to run was a little bit lower. So instead of no loading at like 13.5 that these would do and running at a higher RPM, you might no load these at like 13, that kind of, you know, RPM range. And they made power a little bit lower in the power band, but they made good power. You know, they could pull a longer bar. That's what they were designed for. I like these. They run good. So those are the 3 original edition cylinders. And Jonsered never did get this one, so we're going to quickly put this one on the side. And again, this was the 372 XPW. And the first year they put it out, they called it a 375. I actually have saws that have a 375 sticker for the pull start, but it said 372 XPW on the case. So they very quickly went from 375 to 372 XPW. And yet again, it was that 51.4 millimeter cylinder with those little bit smaller transfer ports. And don't diss them, they made good strong power. Jonsered never got one of these. These are the 2 cylinders that they had in the original edition saws. So let me put this in the junk pile. So 372, 371, 50 millimeter big transfers, strong saw. 365 special. See where it says special? Doesn't say XP or none of that stuff. It just says special. 48 millimeter bore, smaller transfers. They run good. Put this one away. Also in the junk pile. Now as a sidebar, some of the early 365s came with an open port cylinder and kind of a square intake. I don't have one of those cylinders. Not many people kept them because you could bolt on the, you know, these later designs. So we're just going to ignore them for now, but they do exist. Jonsered did get the benefit of these 2 cylinder designs. Produced a 2065, which eventually turned into a 2165, and the 50 millimeter 372 cylinder came in the 2071, and then again in the 2171, and there were some differences in those models, filters, plastic, stuff like that. I'm not going to get into the details. And then they also, what's that say right there? 63. They came up with a small mount version of these cases. Husqvarna did too, but Jonsered had the 2163, which effectively is, again, this basic cylinder layout, but instead of being on the large mount 372 or 2171 style cases, it was on a small mount. I happen to like them. Here's an example of one. And this one happens to be the 2063, but there was also a 2163. And they're kind of rare as hen's teeth. We'll just leave this one right here as an example of a small mount version of that 2071, 2172 set of cases that Jonsered offered, and this one here happens to be a 2063. I'm going to put it on the side because a lot of people are just not going to be interested in those. Get back to the meat. Get back to our 48 millimeter 365 special 50 millimeter 372 XP cylinder. And then Jonsered came out with a 2071, a 2171, and then on the 48 millimeter, a 2065 and a 2165. All right, that's these guys. And that corresponded to the Husqvarna 365 special, which would be the same as a 2065 and a 2165. And the 372 would correspond to the 2071 and the 2171. So we clear on that? That's original edition. And here's a 2171 saw, but what I did on that is I turned it into what I call a 2175, kind of like the Husqvarna 375. And I had grafted a 51.4 top end. You've seen it in the videos. But that's original edition saw with an original edition cylinder, just the 51.4 instead of the 50. and with the smaller transfers, but trust me, it'll outcut the 50 standard. Another story. In 2010, in my mind, Husqvarna designed a new saw, and even though they called it a 372, it was really something different. And this was the X-Torq 372 offering that came out around 2010. Completely different cylinder design, as you can tell. They had the addition of the straddle ports, and just a different deal. I mean, you don't have to spend a whole lot of time looking at that to recognize that these two designs are different, right? Intake, intake. Caps on the transfers. Decomp on the side on the 50 millimeter and the original edition cylinders. The X-Torqs were both larger in size, but also taller. So the whole saw was redesigned. And the cases, well, I mean, you can retro a lot of the parts back, but even the cases were redesigned in the sense that when the X-Torqs came out, they added a little bit more meat here and a deeper recess for the flange than the original edition ones. And that's because the flange on the X-Torqs went a little deeper than the original edition, so they had to accommodate that. More fin, taller cylinder, so things like the handle and the chain brake handle and the top cover and all that stuff had to be adapted to the taller design. So Husqvarna offered that as a 365, the same cylinder, same 70 millimeter cylinder, just with some fins in the transfer caps, and then the 372 XP, which we all know and love. Jonsered offered that in a 2166. Again, the taller handle, chain brake, taller top cover, to accommodate that 70cc 50 millimeter cylinder, which is now taller than the previous designs. And they offered it in the 2172. Those are both X-Torqs. The 66, the 2166, and the 2172 are both with that very same cylinder. Hopefully that clears it up. There are a couple of things to note, and this is going to get off into the weeds some, is as time went on, I mean, Husky started with those and they had some issues, you know, bearings and stuff like that. And I'm pretty sure that was a machining issue in the cases more than the bearings. It just made them run hot. And my steel cage bearings could handle that alignment issue. They could handle the heat better, so that's why they survived. The nylons, when they were done properly, they survived just fine. Another issue. But a couple of things to think about is the taller piston on the X-Torqs are heavier. So there were some changes in the crankshaft. And the way the saw wanted to run, they came up with an ignition system that was rev limited to 13,300 RPMs. And as they developed that saw further, they did things like change the timing curve to make them have a little bit different advance at the low side, make it easier to start, but also make it idle better. And they also made them actually generate a little spark a little bit sooner in terms of how many RPMs it took to get them to create a spark. Bottom line is that newer X-Torq ignition is basically an upgrade for all of them, even the old ones, my humble opinion. And so yeah, the cases were different. You can't, not that you'd want to, but you can't put the X-Torq cylinder easily on the old cases without taking off some of the flange and doing some other things. Put these in the junk pile. So along with, you know, things like the intake being different, carburetors being different, these got a little larger carburetor because the bore of the carburetor also has to take the air for the straddle ports. So it's got a larger diameter carburetor, and therefore obviously the intake boots can be a little bit different. But also, since that carburetor splits the air from the mixed air down, goes down through the bottom. But since this has to flow straight air across the top, mixed air down the bottom, obviously the carburetor had to be a larger diameter, right? That's just kind of common sense. So I guess I should leave it at that, but I can't. There's advantages on both these designs, depending on who you are and what you're trying to accomplish. These, you know, after a period of time, they developed these into a very, very reliable saw. And there's actually a service bulletin, much to my friend's chagrin, 2017, where they had made changes in the crankshaft and stuff like that. All of it basically was about balance. Bigger, heavier piston. So when you start mixing and matching parts, you got to be cognizant of that. You kind of want to use the original edition crankshaft with the original edition pistons and top ends. And you kind of want to use the X-Torq crankshafts with the X-Torq or XPW top end. Which brings up another point. When I was doing X-Torq to original edition conversions, I used the 51.4 millimeter top end more often than not when they were available. They're no longer available. And part of the reason was the RPMs that the 51.4 wanted to run were more in line with the RPMs that an X-Torq saw would run. So that meant that the ignition matched up better. And the heavier piston matched up better with the weight of the X-Torq's piston. And that's basically why I did it. There's a bunch of other reasons, but that's basically the heart of it. So they basically matched up really nice. You know. The second thing is, the people who like to learn how to mod saws, the X-Torq cylinder is actually easier to modify and get power out of than the original edition for most people. Not all, but for most. And that's the reason why. Because you can get right into the transfers with a normal Dremel tool instead of having to have an angle head micro grinder to get on the inside of those things. You know? So these are a great, I mean, the 372 X-Torqs are a great saw for a guy to want to go and grind on, have fun with. And like I said, after 2017 or so, they made them pretty rugged. And they've gone through yet another case upgrade. Not sure why, but they did. But I guess the point is that there's some advantages to this design. Now Jonsered, well, I mean, they turned into Red Max, so I'm not sure about that line. I don't believe that the Jonsered ever got the upgrades that the X-Torq got in the later years, because I think Jonsered was already out of business, you know, as a product line. So most of the 2172s and most of the 2166s have got the older version of the cases. And what I've done on mine is I've converted them to the to my preferred bearings. And I'm not sure that really matters. It's just why I did that. And really not much more to say about it, but I think they're a pretty good looking saw. This little thing's a hot rod. I like this. What I had done with the 2166 I have here was I had taken off the X-Torq top end and blended a 48 millimeter Husqvarna or 2165 top end with an X-Torq carburetor. I blended the bottom of the ports to match the cases, because you see how they're small, and you see how the X-Torq, that black area is where there's case opening but the port doesn't match. So I take those things and I kind of roll them or blend them in to make it flow a little bit better. So I had done that on the 48. I put the later ignition system on it, and because the carburetor is a little bit longer, I pretty much had to cut the cover to make that big air filter fit. And a typical muffler mod. And this saw here is, for what it is, for the amount of effort I put into it, it's been a shocker in terms of what it makes for power. So, what's this over here? Oh, look at this. That, my friends, is actually a 2171, not a 2172. And it would take a pretty practiced eye for a person to see the difference. So, Yeah, this is the old original 372 pattern, and obviously the carburetor is different. Cylinder is different, as we just discussed. And here is the original edition filter holder. Here is an X-Torq filter holder. This is what I was talking about, how the air goes in through the carburetor. And here is the X-Torq intake boot. That straight air goes right through there to the straddle ports. And that goes right down to the bottom of the motor there for power. Here's the original edition boot, so obviously there's difference in the boots, the filter holders, the carburetors, cylinders. As far as I was concerned, it's a different saw. What I do with them is this, is I just gut that stuff out of there. Another story. I wanted just to review the different models in a brief overview of the differences between original edition and X-Torq. That's the purpose of this. This is original edition, that's X-Torq, 372, 365, or 2171, 2165, and this would be the 2166 or 2172. I don't feel like getting into the weeds. Does anyone know what this one is? Should know. It's a pretty famous big old saw. And look at that. It looks like it would fit on the same place. This is an older design. And this is a newer design. And I'll tell you what. One of the reasons why some will say this version will run better than this version of this saw is take a look at that fin on the inside of that transfer. But also look at the way it splits at the combustion chamber. So you gain some, you lose some. This one came off a 394 and this one came off a 395. Trivia. I find these kind of interesting. Again, here's some more trivia. Again, this is your standard 372, and notice that the transfers on this one are quite a bit smaller on the X-Torq. And if it was all about transfer size, these guys wouldn't make anywhere near as much power as these did. But they do. Some cases, more transfer means more power. You can argue that these will make a little more power than this version. That's a maybe. That's a big maybe. Anyone know what this is? That's a pretty sophisticated design right there. Look at those holes right there. And yet another little mystery. If it's all about port size, how come this saw right here? This, by the way, is a 576 top end. The 575 had these spread a little further apart. This 576 is going to make as much power, if not more power, than this 372. But look at the difference in this port size. So it's not just about port size, guys. Look at those transfers. Isn't that goofy? And the funny thing about these, and people have a hard time with it, look how long they are. But also look how they wrap up around the exhaust, where the transfers in these old cylinders, they just go straight from the bottom to the top. Big difference. So why are they doing that? And one of the interesting mysteries is how some of the builders hate these. They also hate things like the 562s. And part of the reason is, building these, there's sort of a, whether it's this style, or trivia, if you know what this one is. These behave in a way that people understand. You know, the basics about building the the old original edition style cylinders, be it steel or Husqvarna. That's pretty easy. People know how to do it, so they replicate the same pattern over and over again. But these are different, and they respond differently. So yeah, things like compression are going to do similar things, but they require a little bit different, well, port timing, and you got to deal with the strato ports. They just don't respond the same, so they don't like them. Just as simple as that. Now, again, if it was all about transfer size, somebody wants to make it all about transfer size, I'll tell you right now, this cylinder here makes a lot more power than this one. And the funny thing is, I couldn't help myself. I was talking to a friend of mine, and they were like all crazy about how come an effectively 385 or 390 top end was making so much more power than these. And I guess the message is this. No replacement for displacement, number one. It's not about lots more transfer size. It's about the right transfer size in order to maximize a particular cylinder design. And that's going to be really, really hard for some guys to get. And the 385 arguably runs better than these. This is a 390. I wonder if I have a 385 cylinder around. There's a 385, and there's a 390. The biggest difference is displacement, obviously. And but it kills me that one of my more entertaining friends, if you go by their metric about how a saw should run, these bigger transfers in this 372 should trash these things. But that ain't the case, is it? No replacement for displacement. That's the message. And not getting into a theory lecture, not yet, but it's a balance of all these things. You just can't hog out transfers and expect to get more power. You can't just hog out the exhaust, change to the blowdowns to something different. You know, the different cylinder designs like different numbers. You know, oftentimes you'll see the X-Torqs liking less blowdown than the original editions. And just because this one likes a certain set of numbers and it's a two-stroke, doesn't mean that transfers over to this. There's so many other factors at play. And I guess that's my message. 385, 390, 372, 576, 372 X-Torq, 394, 395. All of them. They all have different characteristics.